So, hello everyone, konbanwa or ohayo gozaimasu for those of you in Japan. Friends, students, colleagues, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Yves Tiberghien, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Japanese Research at UBC, located in the Institute of Asian Research and the SPPGA. Welcome to this webinar on the politics of the Kishida Cabinet in the Post-Abe Era, co-organized by the CJR here, along with the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the Munk School in Toronto, and the ISS Methodology of Social Science project at the University of Tokyo. After the assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan has been experiencing unprecedented political turmoil. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's state funeral revealed connections to the Unification Church, COVID policies, and increasing concerns about the economy and immigration. We will unpack Kishida policy priorities and achievements to better understand where Japanese politics is heading to. So we're truly thrilled and honored to have a dream lineup today for the discussion. But before going further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that UBC stands on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I also acknowledge the territory of the Hosanich people, where I'm standing tonight, and all the people who have called this area home for many thousands of years and continue to do so today. Since we're on a virtual platform, I'd like to invite you to reflect upon the indigenous lands that you may be on today as well. And I'm turning now to Phillip Lipscy, one of the co-organizers from the University of Toronto.
Thank you, Yves, and welcome everybody. I'm Phillip Lipscy. I direct the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the University of Toronto. I also wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would also like to give special thanks to Yves for proposing this event and the wonderful CJR research and event assistants, Christina Song, Mei Terasawa, and Mo Gasmi, who took the lead in its organization. I also thank Miotsuka at CSGJ for her support. A few logistical announcements for the audience. The chat function has been disabled and questions should be asked through the Q&A window. Please note that this webinar and the Q&A session are being recorded, and we will make it available on the UBC SPPGA, CJR, and CSGJ websites, and University of Tokyo will also share it for a limited period of time. You're not required to use your camera or microphone to participate in the Q&A session. Written questions can be submitted to everyone via the Q&A function and upvoted by you. We will monitor the Q&A window and post questions using attendees' first names. We'll proceed by introducing the wonderful panel of speakers who will be presenting today. We are very thankful for every speaker for taking time for their busy schedules to attend this event. Takako Hikotani is professor at Gakushuin University International Center and senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Asia Society, Japan. From 2016 to 2021, she was the Gerald L. Curtis Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University and continues her affiliation with Columbia as Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. Her research focuses on civil-military relations, Japanese domestic politics, and Japanese foreign policy, with recent publications including How the Ukraine War is Changing Japan, which was published this year in April. Next, we're happy to introduce Dr. Rieko Kage. She is Professor of Political Science at the Department of Advanced Social and International Studies at the University of Tokyo. She is the author of the books Civic Engagement in Post-War Japan, The Revival of a Defeated Society from Cambridge in 2011, and Who Judges? Designing Jury Systems in Japan, East Asia, and Europe, also from Cambridge 2017. She has published widely on issues relating to civic engagement, public opinion, immigration, and Japanese politics. Next, we would like to introduce Dr. Dave Leheny. He is professor in the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies at Waseda University. He previously served as the Henry Wendt III 55 Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University and as assistant and associate professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also as a regional affairs officer in the US Department of State. He has published several influential books, including Empire of Hope, as well as Think Global and Fear Local, both from Cornell University Press. And I'll turn it over to Yves again.
Next, we'd like to introduce Dr. Kenneth McElwain, who is one of the co-organizers of this event. He's a professor of comparative politics at the Institute of Social Science, University of Tokyo. His research focuses on comparative political institutions, most recently on the politics of constitutional design in Japan. His work has been published in a number of journals, edited volumes, and monographs, most recently, The University and Originality of the Japanese Constitution in Quantitative Perspective from Chikura Shobo, 2022. And then finally, among the panelists, we would like to present Dr. Harukata Takenaka, who will actually start the discussion. He's a professor at the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies, known as GRIPS, in Tokyo. His key research areas are democratization in pre-war Japan, the analysis of macroeconomic policy in Japan since the late 80s from a political perspective, and actually many other things. Professor Takenaka's recent publications include expansion of the Japanese Prime Minister's power in the Japanese parliamentary system, transformation of Japanese politics, and institutional reforms. As for Discussant, we're very lucky to have with us Andrew Horvat. Andrew is a senior fellow at the Center for Japanese Research at UBC. As a journalist turned academic, Horvat covered the Asia-Pacific region from the 1970s to the 1990s as a Tokyo-based correspondent for the Associated Press, the Los Angeles Times, the London Independent, and American Public Radio. From 1999 to 2000 to 2005, as Japan representative of the Asia Foundation, Horvat organized public policy programs on immigration, minority issues, and the role of the historical reconciliation issue in regional integration in Europe and Asia. From 2008 to 2013, Dr. Andrew Horvat directed Stanford University's Overseas Studies program in Kyoto, where he taught courses in modern Japanese history and translation. Andrew Horvat is co-editor of Sharing the Burdens of the Past, Legacies of War in Europe, America, and Asia. And without further ado, I'm now going to turn to Professor Harukata Takenaka, who is going to speak for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. The floor is yours, Harukata. You're still muted.
Oh, hold on. Oh, so okay, thank you very much for having me this morning. I would like to thank Yves, Phillip, and Kenneth for holding this webinar. Hold on. I just like to quickly go over 3 issues. First, my title is Kishida has great ideas, but is now pushed into a corner. I would like to cover 3 issues. Firstly, the characteristics of the Kishida administration. And the second issues are on 2 major policies, economic security policy and defense policy. The third is the political challenge Prime Minister Kishida now faces. Okay. So let me start with the nature of the current, the administration. We should note that I have put blue and orange those ministers from Kishida faction and Kishida faction, also faction and independents. And this means that this shows that Prime Minister Kishida has picked up ministers for important positions from his faction, Kishida faction, or his sister faction, also faction, or independents who do not have affiliation with any factions. This suggests that he tries to retain strong control over his cabinet. Just to confirm, the ASO faction and the Kishida faction, sister functions, and I mean ASO function really is a derivative. I mean is originated from Kishida faction, and they are on friendly terms. Okay. And the other characteristic is that under the Kishida administration, like previous administrations such as the Abe cabinet, the prime minister's office plays a leading role in the policy formulation process. He has appointed politicians and bureaucrats who are well versed in policies to the Kante or the prime minister's office. And among politicians, the key person is Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary Seiji Kihara. He's close aide to the Prime Minister Kishida, and he played a major role in preparing the major policy of the cabinet, known as a new form of capitalism. We should also note that there are many talented senior ranking bureaucrats as Prime Minister secretaries. For example, Mr. Shimada who is one of two political secretaries, was a former vice minister of METI. And to appoint a former vice minister to the position of the prime minister secretary is unprecedented. And also, we have many administrative secretaries who served in senior positions in various ministries. And we should also note that Ministry of Finance has sent two bureaucrats as administrative secretaries, and this is also unprecedented. And it's so many senior people, many senior officials serve in prime minister's office as prime minister's secretaries, and seniority really matters in Japanese bureaucratic organizations, and this means that they can really issue instructions to public officials in various ministries very effectively. And we observe continuous expansion in the number of public officials in the cabinet secretariat. And this is the number, I mean, the red line shows the total number of public officials working in the cabinet secretariat. And we also observe continuous expansion of special policy units in the cabinet secretariat, which formulate policies which the prime minister attaches importance. Okay, so and now Prime Minister Kishida pursues new form of capitalism as the main policy of his cabinet. And let me explain what he tries to do under this banner of new form of capitalism. And he will expand investment in technologies, and he has introduced a 10 trillion yen fund to support research in sciences in major universities. And so we are expecting that we can get about 300 billion yen annually to provide research grants to major universities. And also, he will increase investment in the field of semiconductor, quantum computer, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. They made a commitment that the government will make 30 trillion yen within 5 years from 2021, and expecting that the government and private sector together will spend 120 trillion yen in these 5 years. And also, he will expand investment in green transformation or decarbonization technology. This is the amount, I mean, about 150 trillion altogether by the government and private sector in 10 years. And economic security, he also pushes forward economic security policy, and he aims to secure important materials and equipments. And we call them specially important materials, tokutei juyo bushi for Japanese economy. And the administration will specify what they are by the end of the year, but we are expecting that they will specify semiconductors, batteries, rare earth metals, medical supplies, and mineral resources as these are especially important materials. What he tries to do is we try to secure these materials and equipments either domestically or from our allies or like-minded countries, and reduce our dependence on China on these materials. And what Kishida administration has been doing very seriously is try to make more investment for semiconductors. And he has spent $2.4 billion to invite TSMC to Kumamoto prefectures to introduce a new factory. And Prime Minister Kishida made agreement with the United States government to launch a joint research on advanced semiconductor technology and to set up a new research center in Japan. And his cabinet just has included $8 billion within second supplementary budget for the fiscal year 2022 to invest in high-end semiconductors. And he has made commitment for more investment for other technologies such as batteries. But there remain serious questions because we aren't so sure if the amount of financial resources committed by the Japanese government for the development of advanced semiconductors may not be enough. For example, Samsung has already announced that it will spend $200 billion in 5 years for semiconductor technology. And also what concerns us most is that the situation about the development for electric vehicles. Japanese auto producers such as Toyota have been very slow to produce EVs, while other countries have accelerated development of EVs, not to mention United States, such as Tesla. Yet the Kishida administration has not well addressed this issue. Okay. Now, I think that Takako-san will speak for our own security and foreign policies, but we have to make, the administrations has to make 3 key policies: national security strategy, national defense program guidelines, and midterm defense programs. And what the largest issue is that now the administration is going to expand our defense budget, observing the Ukraine war. And I think it's going to double the size of the budget from 5 trillion yen to 10 trillion yen. But the issue is how to finance this additional 5 trillion yen. And the other issue is, as Yves has just introduced, he suffers from the erosion of political capital. If you look at the cabinet approval rate, it has been going down. The blue line shows those who do not approve. And now this is by Asahi Shimbun. And now those who do not, more than 50% does not approve the current the Kishida administration. And of course, this is a result of the confusion arising from the unification church issue. And many Japanese feel very strong resentment about the strong connection between the LDP politicians, including 8 the ministers in the cabinet with the church. And recently, Special Minister for Economy and Fiscal Policy, Yamagio, has just resigned because of his strong connection with the church. But we have other problems. We have other ministers in trouble. Minister of Justice, Hanashi, was just driven to resign for making incorrect political remarks. And the Minister of Foreign Home Affairs and Communications, Terada, is in trouble for misgivings, for mismanaging his political financial resource, political money. But I think it was really a mistake made by Prime Minister Kishida. He appointed these 2 ministers, Hanashi and Terada, because he respected the seniority system, the old tradition of Japanese politics. And so I think he's not, I mean, the Prime Minister Abe did not really respect the seniority rule. That is, those politicians who got elected 6 terms were expected to become ministers in the old days under 55 system. Prime Minister Abe did not respect that rule, but Prime Minister Kishida gives more respect to that rule, and so he picked up these 2 guys because they were elected 6 times. So what we should note that the Kochika, I mean, his faction, this is really for the first time for his faction to elect to have prime minister, because so I don't think politician from his faction is really well versed under the current political system, which has expanded prime ministerial power. Okay, so I think he respected the old tradition and he got into impasse. Okay. Thank you very much. I spoke a bit about like I think 1 minute longer, but thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Harukata Takenaka-san. This was fascinating, and you covered a good introduction of all the issues that we are now going to deepen more with our next speakers. So our second speaker is Dr. Kenneth McElwain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to UBC, the teams at UBC and Toronto for hosting this event. And I'm glad that the Institute of Social Science can participate as well. I'm Kenneth McElwain. I'm a political scientist by training. And what I want to speak about today is really an answer to this question, whether politics has gone post-COVID in Japan. As Harukata mentioned at the beginning, the Kishida Cabinet's initial agenda was set very much by what was left over from the second Abe administration, as well as the Suga Cabinet, the short-lived Suga Cabinet. And really, since 2020, politics in Japan, policy priorities have been focused on how to address the global COVID pandemic. And my answer to this question is, at least for now, yes, politics has gone post-COVID, or at least public opinion towards politics has gone post-COVID. And I really want to speak about this graph, which will require a little bit of explanation. This is based on data collected by our institute, ISS's COVID project. And what we've been doing is, since April 2020, we have been running a series of panel surveys. What this means is that we've been polling the same people repeatedly at intervals, asking them for their opinions on a variety of political, public policy, social, economic issues. And this data comes from our second panel survey, and it addresses responses to a question that we asked in March 2021, which is our wave 2, November 21, which was right after the lower house election, and in July 2022, immediately after the upper house election. And in these surveys, we asked respondents in the upcoming election, or the election that just passed, what was the top 3 issues that you care about in making your vote choice? And from that, we selected which issue was the top choice, the number 1 choice among respondents. And what this diagram shows is how people's opinion towards policy priorities has shifted from March 21 to July 22. The green area is the proportion of people who selected COVID as their top priority. That was 42% of our respondents in March 21. By the lower house election held 6 months later, that proportion had fallen to 28%. And as of the upper house election that was just held this past July, that proportion has fallen to 7.5%. So this is a massive drop in the proportion of people who care about COVID. And again, to reiterate, these are the same people that are tracked over time. So where do those people who care about, who used to care about COVID, move to? There's been a slight increase in those who care about social welfare related issues. That's the blue area, which has increased marginally from 21 to 23 to 25%. But the big transition has been a renewed focus on the economy. That has spiked from 26% all the way up to 46%, almost doubled in priority. This trend of moving away from COVID is particularly pronounced among our male respondents. So women continue to care more about COVID than men. And it's been especially pronounced among left-wing party supporters. I think for the left-wing opposition parties, hammering and criticizing the LDP's handling of COVID was an electoral strategy. But even among those who support those parties, interest in COVID has fallen quite significantly. My next point, this isn't a figure, but a summary, is how has Kishida and the LDP in general fared as people's attention towards COVID has changed, and what's really changed people's attitudes towards COVID. And the simple story is vaccinations improve people's assessment of the LDP and the Prime Minister's competence, and that's increased the tendency to vote for the LDP. So looking at the 22 upper house election, those who received a vaccine for COVID had a higher likelihood of voting for the LDP. Overall, we see a 6.4% increase in voting for the LDP, and among independent voters, those who don't support any party, that's even larger at 11.1%. And the channel through this works is essentially people's assessments of how Kishida has handled COVID has improved markedly. Those who've received vaccines think of Kishida much more positively. And as a side note, those who receive vaccines also think much higher of Prime Minister Suga, former Prime Minister Suga, than they used to. And so I'll end on this note, which is something that Harukata also mentioned. It's hard to say it's post-COVID insofar as we may see a new wave in this winter season, but I think Kishida no longer needs to focus as much on how to handle COVID policies, or at least voters' interests aren't on those topics at the moment. And instead, he needs to ensure that his perceived competence on bread and butter issues like the economy and welfare improves. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kenneth, for this great talk. So now we're going to turn to Dr. Rieko Kage for additional presentation.
Great. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly share my slide. Okay, I hope that everybody can see this. I'm actually going to pick up just where Kenneth left off with the renewed focus on the economy. First of all, I'd like to I'd like to thank Yves, Phillip, and Kenneth for organizing this event and the team at UBC. It's a great honor to be here, and I will be speaking on immigration issues, and especially in the context of gender. And so just to take a quick look back at the last 3 years, of course, across the OECD, there was an increase in unemployment rates as COVID struck. Japan, in the context of the OECD, suffered a relatively modest increase in unemployment rates between 2019 and 2020. I won't show the graphs, but the pattern is quite similar for 2021 as well. And so in terms of the number of individuals in the labor force, we have been seeing really since the beginning of 2022, if not earlier, a recovery in the labor market. There was a steep drop between the summer of the early 2020 and the summer of 2020, but then the trend has been really, especially among the women, going upwards. And so especially in terms of female participation in the labor market, we are seeing unprecedented levels of participation, both in terms of sheer numbers of women in the labor market, as well as in percentages. And so relative to the rest of the OECD, Japan's women are now in the upper half in terms of female labor participation rate. The percentage of women in the labor market is now higher than countries like the United States or France. And with that, we are seeing the erosion of the famous, what is called the M-shaped curve, with women dropping off in large numbers out of the labor market as they get married or have children, and then slowly going back into the labor market as their children grow up. And this compares female labor participation rates in 1981 to 2021 and 2021 and 2021. And you can see here the not quite the disappearance, but really a marked erosion of the M-shaped curve. Women do still drop out of the labor market as they have children, but in much smaller numbers as they compared to what they used to. The curve looks much more like an inverse U than an M-shaped curve. And then this great entry of women into the labor market means that the labor shortage is reemerging in the the labor shortage is reemerging in the Japanese labor market. A very recent survey conducted this past summer shows that 64.9% of small and medium-sized firms now face a labor shortage, and this comes close to peak 2019 levels when the rate was at 66.4%. And this is shown in the ratio of job openings to job applicants as well. Of course, there was a sharp drop between 2019 and 2020 and also 2021, but the ratio has been on the increase, on the rise again in 2022. This ratio tends to fluctuate seasonally with the rate going up towards the end of the year and into early winter. And we have already seen this ratio pick up over the summer, and it should continue to go up towards the end of 2022 and early 2023 as well. So again, the rate should be not quite back up to 2019 levels, but certainly higher than what we saw in 2021. What are the areas of the most acute labor shortage? Home security services sees the highest levels of labor shortage, followed by construction, and then various personal services such as elderly care, domestic work, and so forth, which leads to, again, immigration as a possible solution. And this is this can work in two different, although possibly overlapping ways. Of course, immigration overall helps labor shortage, and that's very simple. But also, the Japanese government has tended to take a targeted approach to immigration, targeting specific areas of the labor market. And so, for instance, targeting the care industry, for instance, could help the Japanese women and liberate them from their care responsibilities and to work longer hours. And what does public opinion say about this? This is a survey that we conducted back in 2016, along with several colleagues. And we actually asked respondents what types of immigrants they would like to see in Japan, or what industries or types of jobs that they would like to see them working in. And this was of a conjoint experiment design. So the respondents were shown two hypothetical respondents with randomized attributes. This is just part of a much larger conjoint experiment that was conducted, but I'm just showing the part that has to do with occupation. And we see two patterns coming out of this. First, there is great support for immigration into the more high-skilled jobs and industries. So doctors, computer programming, scientists, financial analysts, the Japanese public tends to support. And this is actually true of other industrialized countries as well. We see it in the United States, we see it in Canada, we see it in Western Europe as well. The other area of support that we see here is that the public tends to support immigration into the care industries, so elderly care workers and nursing. Whereas in terms of, for instance, construction, which is another area of acute labor shortage, there's much more limited support. So in terms of policies, there seems to be much greater support for increased immigration into the care industries, which would then in turn free up Japanese women to work more hours in the labor market, rather than across the board liberation of immigration. So the current legal framework for care worker immigration in Japan largely has to do with the series of economic partnership agreements that were signed with Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam This arrangement allows nurses and care workers to enter Japan for several years, and then they are expected to pass the national Japanese certification exam, which would then allow them to stay for much more extended periods. And this arrangement has been in place with Indonesia since 2008, the Philippines since 2009, Vietnam since 2014. And as you can see here, the program with elderly care workers has been much more successful than that for nurses. This has to do with the passage rate for the national licensing exams. About 43% of these workers that have come to Japan have passed the national licensing certification exam for elderly care workers, whereas for nurses, it has only been about 9%. So this has really discouraged nurses from coming, whereas the numbers for elderly care workers has been much larger. These workers, despite the immigration restrictions that were put into place in Japan after the COVID pandemic struck, were allowed to enter Japan under special dispensations. And so they continued to come into Japan during 2020-2021. And we expect that these numbers will increase again in 2022 as well. But of course, this is just relative to the labor shortage in Japan, really a drop in the bucket. There is support for more of these workers to come in, but the Kishida Cabinet will probably need to pick up the effort on these. How has the pandemic affected public opinion towards increased immigration? Unfortunately, we don't have the type of fine-grained data that we had from 2016 across different industries or job types. But we did conduct a survey in September 2020 that asked respondents whether they would support increased immigration overall. And to our surprise, despite the much worsened economic conditions in the fall of 2020, we found that the support rates actually were quite identical between May 2016 and September 2020. And this question was asked on a scale of 1 to 5. The rate was about 3, right in the middle, really, around 3 in both surveys, which was somewhat surprising to us. But it is also consistent with what we know from existing literature that in low immigration countries, economic downturns tend to exert little effect over the public's anti-immigration attitudes. So it is consistent with what we know, given the existing studies. Of course, this is not an issue that is salient in the Kishida Cabinet at the moment, but we can see that it is rooting and growing. The labor shortage certainly is adding to the inflation that is already in place, which is exacerbating the decline in the cabinet's approval ratings that Professor Takenaka spoke about. So if not Prime Minister Kishida, some prime minister in the not too distant future will be expected to have to deal with this issue. So I will stop there. Thank you for your kind attention, and I will look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rieko Kage. That was fascinating. We're now going to turn to our fourth speaker, Professor David Leheny. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I've got to apologize. I realized because of my new computer, I haven't actually configured it to share PowerPoint. So I'll be going without the photos that I'd actually prepared, for which I apologize. Though all that they would have done is given you something to look at other than my face for the next few minutes. So while I recognize that's a cost for everybody, I don't think that it's going to dramatically affect what it is I wanted to talk about today, which is really just about the politics of the state funeral. Before I do want to thank my colleagues, and I especially want to thank Yves and Kenneth and Phillip for inviting me on board, as well as the staff members who have put together a really, really great program. It's a great honor to be speaking with my colleagues here. As I think everybody knows, the state funeral itself for Prime Minister Abe became perhaps much more controversial than most had anticipated, although that's probably because of our own failure of imagination rather than because of any sort of real gap in the news about it. In fact, state funerals, as most of you know, are quite unusual in Japan for anyone other than members of the royal family. Prime Minister Yoshida had one, but even in that case, there was a fair amount of prior work by Prime Minister Sato in order to ensure that he had the at least acceptance, tacit acceptance of the Socialist Party to prevent what could have been a thorny constitutional question from becoming a real political issue. The state funeral itself for Prime Minister Abe in some ways served exactly the function that one might expect a state funeral to promote, which is to give the opportunity to the nation to mourn. And we can see that certainly in the images of the funeral of course, his wife, his widow, Abe Akie, crying with her mask on, Prime Minister Kishida apparently crying. That's a little bit less clear, but also the images that were broadcast repeatedly in the news media afterwards of hundreds, thousands of people outside mourning, many of them in tears. There was one sort of notable broadcast of a high school boy in his uniform who had skipped school that day in order to come to the outdoors area around the funeral in order to pay his respects, tearfully talking about how sad he was that former Prime Minister Abe had been killed. And these sort of outpourings of grief, I think, are fairly common and not terribly surprising, and also I think fairly genuine. I mean, certainly we can talk about the political machinations behind something like a state event, which is important. But I think it's important as well to think about the actual genuine emotionality that gets attended to it. But if we just locate this in mourning and sadness, I think we miss a large amount of what was actually going on. Because as everyone also knows, thousands of protesters took to the streets, not just in Tokyo, but around the country. There were small demonstrations in major cities around Japan, protesting the state funeral and what they saw to be an abuse of government authority, and calling it without any sort of clear political or constitutional authority to do so. Now, these are very, very thorny questions. I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on the Constitution that, for example, Professor McElwain is. But it is clear that in prior instances, the government tread very, very softly. Prime Minister Sato, as I'd said, had gotten permission from the Socialist Party to go ahead with a state funeral for former Prime Minister Yoshida, but he had done that by promising that this would not be a precedent. This was not going to happen again. And in the aftermath of that, when Prime Minister Sato himself had died, at that point, the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history, the winner of the Nobel Prize and so forth, Prime Minister Miki thought about giving him a state funeral and actually decided against it because they were concerned about constitutional authority and also felt that they couldn't actually get buy-in from the other political parties. They didn't want to turn it into a controversy. Instead, they held a national funeral. Maybe a distinction without that much of a difference, but apparently important enough that it actually prevented it from becoming the main controversy that the Abe state funeral did. What is interesting is how much of the outrage is supposedly directed at the cost of it. Now, the cost itself is not incidental. It's, I guess, 1.2 billion yen in the final analysis, which I think in current exchange rates is $17 US. But it's a lot more than that, obviously, in terms of what it means to the public. I mean, even my 10-year-old son apparently was talking about the cost of the funeral with his friends at school, which I found utterly bizarre because to me, $8 million is really a rounding error, at least when we're talking about something as massive as a government budget. But when we actually think about the emotions connecting the groups who are protesting against it, there are photos of the protesters sort of gleefully chanting, walking down the street, smiling about this, photos of elderly demonstrators the day beforehand, sort of organizing a new group to protest the funeral itself. And this is what we expect from social movements. Social movements are fun, even when they're actually connected to something that can be jarring, depressing, very, very sad, such as the assassination of Prime Minister Abe. And that's not even getting into the darkest directions of the emotional representations of the funeral. There were people at the event itself or at the marches outdoors who were openly mocking Prime Minister Abe, including a photo I found on Twitter of people pretending to shoot guys wearing T-shirts with different photos of Abe on them. My graduate student at Waseda, Romeo Marcantoni, has found a few more of these. I'm sort of glad not to be showing those pictures because I do find them somewhat upsetting. My point simply is that the attention to Abe on this sort of is indicative, I think, of his own particular place in Japanese politics and something that I think Kishida himself probably judged very, very poorly in terms of what would be the consequences of hosting a state funeral without having actually gone through the proper channels to do so. And the hearings that are going to come up in the Diet in the next few months about this will really focus on that process. But had there been a process, had there really been an effort to get some sort of buy-in from the opposition parties, almost certainly they would have said no. So there would have been no state funeral in the first place, which raises the question again of why actually go ahead with it in the first place? What does this actually do? What does it actually accomplish? In the past couple of years, I've been working on a project that talks about the thwarted commemorations, commemorative events that didn't really work out for Japan. For example, the 2018 celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, which Prime Minister Abe clearly wanted to turn into a major event. And instead, because it was too controversial, because of divided opinions about the Boshin War and the Meiji Restoration itself, had to turn into basically a 90-minute session with some legislators, and that was it. Of course, the famously sort of lonely and sad Olympics of 2021 did not become the celebration of Japan's place on the global stage that Prime Minister Abe and many of his supporters had planned it to be. That was, of course, not because of anything that Abe had chosen or anything that had gone wrong, but it does suggest something about the emotional connections that people can have to commemorations that don't work. And in this case, I do think that the failure of the funeral to unite the country is indicative of a certain concern that many have about the possibility of gimmickry in politics. The literary theorist Xian Nagai has written a book called Theory of the Gimmick, in which he talks about the gimmick, the sort of labor-saving device that also looks really cheap and trinkety, as the greatest embarrassment of capitalism. And I think we might say that about democracy as well, insofar as people want, or voters presumably express, a desire to have something genuine, like genuine labor, genuine effort on the part of the government, and anything that seems like a shortcut can easily be mocked or ridiculed. And Kishida himself, I think, didn't sense the way in which a hastily arranged funeral would do nothing to actually unify national emotion in any sort of cohesive fashion, but would instead become a possibility for voters to turn on him and his party. I could talk more about this. I don't want to go on too long, especially because we have one more great speaker behind me. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over now to Professor Hikotani. I apologize for taking too much time. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Leheny. That was very interesting, something that we don't hear often. So finally, I'm turning to Professor Takako Hikotani for further remarks on policy and foreign policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for including me in this great panel. Can you hear me okay? Is that
yes.
So I'd like to pick up on where Dave left off, and I guess we go back to loop back to Professor Takenaka's starting remarks, and he had to leave early, unfortunately. So try to bring back what he suggested. And I guess the big question is, why is Kishida so unpopular? And why was he sort of okay? His approval rating was relatively high, and it just kept on dropping. And is it just about the Unification Church, or is it what the Unification Church debacle kind of represents about his style of politics, that there seems to be over attention to what might cost him, which tends to sort of work the other way, that I think that it wouldn't have been as controversial if it wasn't called a state funeral, and they would have been able to do a much grander funeral without being so worried about the repercussions if he didn't hastily decide to do it a state funeral for whatever reason. And possibly some have said that that's because he was so fearful of the Abe allies being against him if he doesn't honor Abe's passing in a state funeral forum. The other part that seems to be hurting him is the apparent indecisiveness and somehow reluctance to do something new. And it seems that he was follow more of the textbook of you have to appoint a minister by the seniority, but indecisive about firing them when that seemed to be necessary from the public opinion's point of view. So probably that seems to be not really specifically what he did, but how he handled things seemed to be hurting, and what he's fearful of seems to be hurting him more than his actual policy. And so I guess the question is, can he look forward to the bounce that he's expecting after the G7 meeting, hosting the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, somehow weather the storm for now and sort of wait for his hosting of the G7 summit in Hiroshima to be something that leads to more popularity for him? And some have argued that that's what he would like to accomplish, because people tend to forget that he was a very long-serving foreign minister under Prime Minister Abe. That tends to be sort of overshadowed, probably because Prime Minister Abe was very front and center of his own diplomacy. But it is true that Foreign Minister Kishida was foreign minister from December 2012 to August 2017. So he was the one who made possible what was at least partly responsible and contributed to President Obama's visit to Hiroshima. And also he was there during the difficult transition to the Trump administration. So in a way, he was there and saw that, and he thinks foreign policy could be his forte, but unfortunately, it's not seen as such by many people. So right now, he is going to be having a meeting with President Xi on the 17th. But that's not what is really being talked about much in Japan. And that doesn't seem to be seen as so much of a boost right now. And so that, I think, is where we need to look at how things evolve. But let me just go through a couple of things that are on the table and that he will have to look forward to work on. And just to go back a bit, I think what's interesting about Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy is that he didn't really change things as much as people thought. It was more about keeping Japan able to go by what I would call Japan's plan A for keeping itself safe, which is maintain the US-Japan alliance and have it going. And also what's kind of interesting and ironic is that he did so without changing the Constitution, but reinterpreting the Constitution to make it possible for it to somehow coexist with the US-Japan alliance and what more Japan might be doing for the alliance. And that, I think, set the stage for what's for Japan going forward. Also, Prime Minister Abe beefed up the institutional basis, which, as Prime Minister, was Professor Takenaka mentioned, the institutions are still there. We have a different group of people, but we do have a Team Kishida, which may not be as strong and tightly bond as Team Abe, but it's there. And finally, he left behind the free and open Indo-Pacific concept and tried to make more friends other than just the US kind of strategy in the Quad and other workings with European countries, and that's already there. So what does Kishida have to do? I guess the challenge for him is that Prime Minister Abe sort of left behind the difficult ones. And I think the first difficult one is to increase defense spending for Japan and for Japan to do more in terms of what it has. And the public does seem to support that to a very surprising degree of increasing defense budget. It's really remarkable that now the Japanese government is trying to make sure to count the defense spending in a way that it looks like it's more. And that somewhat sort of had it including by different parts of Japanese government so that it'll add up to 2% of the GDP. And that quite a change from what we see before. And we can attribute several reasons for that, but just to sort of go through the list of things that Kishida has to do. One, Japan will be drafting the national security strategy or revising the national security strategy and coming up the defense spending. That's going to be by the end of December. And I think two things are going to be most important as a topic. One is the counterattack capability, and that is there's two parts of it. One is whether and why we need to obtain it altogether, and two, how exactly it's going to be used. And the weather question, I guess the common answer is that we can't, missile defense has its limits. Both North Korea and China is way too advanced for us to be able to block everything. And so we need some deterrent. And that there's an argument to be made that having a counterattack capability will have North Korea or China think twice. So whether or not that's the case. And the other question that is raised by Komeito and others is whether or not, like how exactly and when exactly we're going to exercise the counterattack capability, how much of that is seen to be infringing upon the Constitution. That's the counterpart argument. And the other is the spending once again. According to the poll by NHK in October, many people are supporting, more than half of the Japanese public across different polls are supportive of increase in defense budget. But the NHK poll asked how exactly we're going to pay for it. And 61% of the Japanese public said cut other budgets. So like not increase the spending altogether, but cut other Japanese government spending. And that's actually a tough call because it's very hard to cut the social science, social security spending and whatnot. So 61% do not want the budget to go up, but for the defense budget to expand while other budgets are shrunk. But that's actually kind of hard. 19% calls for issuing bonds and 60% calls for raising taxes. And I think how exactly we're going to spend more on defense while keeping the budget under control is going to be a question that we have to face. I mean, I guess if I were to add third thing, I guess the debate has shifted, especially after the Ukraine war, in Japan, that the choices that the Kishida makes in terms of defense policy has to be not just about its consistency with what we have in terms of the constitution, but how exactly Japan is made safe. And there's no 100% guarantee of success of deterring North Korea, China. He has to go on uncertain grounds about making the case about what Japan's going to be doing and obtaining for defense is going to be better for Japan and safe for the Japanese public. And I think the support for increasing defense budget comes from Japanese people's fear that they're not as safe as before. But whether or not doing certain things would lead to Japan's safety is really up in the air. And I think that's something that Kishida needs to explain to the public, but I'm not too sure if it's doing that right now. And I think depending on how things proceed with the defense spending, it might hurt him in his approval rating. Just to add two more things. One, Japan, China, and there is going to be, as I said, a meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Kishida in Thailand on the 17th, and that's the first time in 3 years. Just to remember, there was supposed to be a meeting in April 2020, right before COVID. So pre-COVID, there was supposed to be a Japan-China summit meeting. It got in that Xi Jinping was supposed to come to Japan when the cherry blossoms are blooming. That never happened because cherry blossoms were blooming, but COVID was also in Japan. But now we have to, things are very different between Japan and China, and Kishida has to step up into the summit meeting. Fortunately, the Biden-Xi meeting that took place last night seemed to have gone fairly well. But with that, it will be very interesting for Japan to try to be on the same page as the US, but at the same time, approach China in a way that Japan is most comfortable doing, and that people tend to forget that it's the 50th year since Japan and China's normalization, and there wasn't that much of a celebration for that, but how exactly to balance Japan's own interest and at the same time being on the same page with the US in dealing with China will be something that I have to work on. And finally, Japan and India, just to throw that in, I think Abe's unsurprising legacy going forward might be the improving relationship with Japan and India and expanding the concept of Indo-Pacific to India. And that had a lot to do with Abe's personal relationship with President Modi. And that was very apparent in the funeral that took place. And that was one of the most moving scenes during the funeral that Modi came and paid his respects. So that, I think, the personal factor of Abe administration, since he was prime minister for so long, and he did initiate new initiatives that has the Abe brand name. For Kishida to actually try to get a boost from foreign policy, it will take a lot of effort for him to get the Kishida label on, and whether that will lead to more approval for Kishida, I think we have to wait and see. But these are just things that he has to do and the difficult homework that he has to deal with that Abe has left behind for him. Thanks so much.
If you're muted.
So that was a real tour de force, Professor Hikotani. Thank you very much for that. And now, last but not least, we're turning to Andrew Horvat for some discussant ideas and comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists and organizers. This really is what you would call an incredible feast of all sorts of ideas and comment, how can I put it, present ideas and references to ongoing events that are very difficult to, shall we say, to put into just a single whole. So let me do what the front page of a newspaper might do, which is to deal with each article sort of separately. First of all, I noticed that Mr. Abe's shadow is being cast very much both on our discussions here and also on Mr. Kishida's own present options and the way he is perceived. In fact, I see in many of the Japanese newspaper articles and on television attempts to compare somewhat unfairly Kishida to Abe. And much of this comes from the probably from the Abe faction itself. And it's been mentioned that Kishida is slow. He doesn't make his judgments quickly. He appoints the wrong people. This has been mentioned with regard to the Justice Minister Hanashi, who made some inappropriate remarks about how a Justice Minister is only appears in the newspapers when his signature is required on to send someone on death row to his execution. And this was correctly, I think, viewed as totally inappropriate. Again, his other minister, Yamagiwa, whose connections with the Moonies was ended up becoming a liability. Again, there was some backbiting within the party saying, oh, well, you should have gotten rid of him much more quickly. As an old news reporter, I remember that Mr. Abe's record in the Diet answering questions was not particularly great. He ended up causing a lot of trouble. In fact, so much trouble that one of the a senior civil servant felt the need to commit suicide because Mr. Abe lied in Parliament about his wife's connection to the Moritomo Gakuen school, which was to which she had apparently given some money. These comparisons are extremely unfair, and they somehow, of course, the press feeds on this kind of how can I put it, emotional, what is the expression, this kind of rancor. But is it really fair? When we examine carefully, I'd like to ask the other panelists, do you really think that Mr. Kishida has so much to worry about within his party? Isn't it true that the Abe faction itself is in disarray? That there is great, that some 37 of the 97 members have been implicated in the Mooney scandal. And that surely there hardly can be any kind of a rival coming out from there. The other issue is the state funeral matter, of course, has been a complete disaster for him. But one wonders whether this is really going to last forever. And I'm wondering whether it isn't one of those, how can I put it? I wouldn't call it exactly a tempest in a teapot, but it is again one of those emotional issues. My concern rather is what is not talked about in the press, and what fortunately I think the panelists have discussed, which is the issue of Japan's economic malaise, the absence of innovation. When we talk about immigration, well, we're also talking about Japan's demographic crisis, which is not being discussed, and for which I think the Prime Minister can be called to account. I took the trouble of listening to his speech on October 3rd in the Diet, in which he actually goes into quite a lot of detail about what he wants to do. He really wants to restart nuclear generators, nuclear power generators. He mentioned that he wants to restart between 10 and 20. Do you think that he'll have a chance to do that? He spoke about that in terms of meeting Japan's goals for carbon emission control. Does Japan have actually any other choices? This is going to be really politically very challenging in a country where nuclear energy is not popular. Also, with regard to innovation, there's a whole issue not only of immigration, but also of what you may call Japan's lagging international education policies, globalization, they call it global jinzai ikse. Is this really happening? Shouldn't the government be taking more of an interest in the fact that fewer Japanese are going abroad, that fewer Japanese are capable of relating to the rest of the world? How is he going to actually activate the Japanese economy and create innovation and double startups, as he claims he will do in 5 years, if there are not enough Japanese graduates of universities who can actually speak in English to the rest of the world? I've watched the Japanese news reports on the midterm elections in the United States, and I was shocked that they were still calling a red wave well after it was quite clear that there was no red wave, not even a ripple. And so I asked around what's going on, and the fact is that Japanese news reporters can't actually access information in English quickly enough. This is a crisis. These things are not being addressed. There's a whole range of other issues about Mr. Kishida's record as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Well, I don't know about anyone else here, but no one seems to mention that he is involved with, one of his greatest challenges is to solve the festering issue with South Korea. This is often discussed in terms of the forced labor compensation issue, but actually it goes back to 2015 when he was the prime mover of a rather botched attempt to solve the comfort women issue, in which there was virtually no consultation with stakeholders, in which the Koreans were effectively humiliated, and some of the Japanese right-wing parliamentarians said, well, you see, you can't trust them. This is a festering issue which also has to be solved for Japan's own sake, for Japan's capability of functioning in the regional environment. Do I have a few more minutes?
Not really, maybe 30 seconds to wrap up, because we have—
Okay, 30 seconds. Okay, I'll tell you very simply. I really appreciate this opportunity because as an ex-reporter, I realize the value of talking to academics. They really do go deeper. On the other hand, the value of the journalists is that they don't lose sight of what the how can I put it, of what can really cause politicians trouble. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very interesting. So I'm turning the mic now to Phillip for the first question.
Sure. I think Andrew asked a lot of very provocative questions. So I'll keep my question to the panel very brief, which is, of course, this is an event about the Kishida government, and each panelist very effectively went through, essentially a slice of the Kishida government's agenda or some policy issue. But looking at recent Japanese prime ministers, there's basically two broad types, right? Kind of the 1 year, very quickly becomes unpopular and is thrown out of office. And then you have Koizumi and Abe, who lasted. But in those two cases, there was a very clear from the outset reform agenda, right? Koizumi very much out of the gate talking about reform without sanctuary. And of course, in the case of Abe, it was Abenomics. And so I thought perhaps new capitalism was Kishida's, sort of answer to this. But at least from my conversations with people, there wasn't much excitement about new capitalism as an agenda. And, the dominant narratives about the prime minister have primarily been about closing the borders in response to Omicron, and then the state funeral and the Unification Church scandal. And so I guess my question is, is there some kind of underlying agenda that's being overshadowed by these two major events that might resurface and essentially rescue the government from becoming a very short-lived and ineffectual government? So is there some hope that the government could amount to more than where things seem to be going at the present, with declining popularity and an agenda that doesn't seem to be making great headway. Thank you.
Can I offer a brief response? And this is purely on a public policy dimension, but for example, the LDP's party popularity and the Prime Minister's approval rating tend to track together to a certain extent. But I think most research clearly shows that the Prime Minister's popularity is a leading indicator, in the sense that when the Prime Minister's popularity goes down, it can drag down the party. And so the point at which the LDP will seriously start considering finding a replacement for Kishida is when Prime Minister's approval falls below the LDP rating. But I think this is an area where the LDP benefits from, and has benefited from for really the last 10 years, from opposition disarray. This is a question that I think Keith Nita raised in the Q&A portion as well. But there's a left-wing opposition, notably the Constitutional Democratic Party, as well as the Communists and Social Democrats. And then there's sort of a center-right-ish challenge to the LDP from Ishin, Democratic Party for the People, I think, is possibly thinking of going in that direction as well. But the opposition still faces hurdles in coordinating candidates against the LDP during elections, for example. So as long as the opposition is in disarray, I think the LDP is less worried about any short or long-term damages to their own standing, and therefore they can tolerate Kishida being unpopular for longer, particularly since the next national elections won't be held till 2025. That's right, 2025.
Would anyone else like to jump in for the question raised by Phillip?
Can I comment just on what Kenneth McElwain has just said? If you look at the recent statements by the opposition parties on what their next step is, I think you will see that Kishida really benefits from this disarray, and not only disarray, but from actually a total absence of long-term thinking on the part of the opposition. All they want is for him to come back from his trips to Bali and to be able to question him on his responsibility for these two hapless ministers that he had to sack. This is not really thinking about the future of the country, is it? And one wonders whether it will really have the impact of causing a decrease or in his popularity, or rather sympathy towards him, and a higher rating for the LDP by comparison. Just a question.
So,
yeah, Kenneth.
Sorry, just on one point. This follows on what Takako said, and also a point that Harukata raised as well, which is, I think prime ministers are increasingly judged on foreign policy acumen. And part of it is that that's the point that they like to sell to the public. It's a policy area that the opposition has much less information access to, and certainly the legislature takes a somewhat secondary role compared to the cabinet, the executive branch. And for certainly the second half of the Abe administration and onwards, when you ask in surveys, the prime minister's handling on varying policy dimensions. Abe, for example, did very poorly on constitutional revision, didn't rate that highly on gender issues or welfare policies, but on foreign policy, he was rated very highly. And this may be in part due to the impression, whether real or not, that he had forged a better relationship with Donald Trump than at least other people did. I don't know if that was a good relationship, but better than others. And I think Kishida may be trying to do this to sell the foreign policy angle, certainly with Japan's response to Ukraine. And if you can keep the public's eyes on those dimensions, then I think it's something that can help rebound his popularity going forward. But I'd be curious to see what Takako thinks about that area.
Thanks. So in response to what Kenneth said, and in response to your comment, Andrew, is that I think it does puzzle us, I think, in general, that why Kishida seems to be so haunted by the right wing of the party. But at the same time, the irony that the more Kishida wants to emphasize the foreign policy acumen, the more he's compared with Prime Minister Abe. And that Abe seemed to have had more of a challenge with the difficult President Trump. And that seemed to have more of an impact than Kishida being good friends with President Biden. That really isn't that interesting. And so in a way, I think that getting the foreign policy boot is difficult, but the more he goes towards that direction, the other irony is that he seems to be more worried about the right wing of the party and hawkish wing of the party, which he actually, as you mentioned, doesn't have to worry. But I think just the fact that they're in disarray and they lost a leader in Prime Minister Abe just makes the dynamics a little bit more difficult. The Prime Minister Abe was sort of the lightning rod for the right wing. And now he's lost the lightning rod, people say, and that's the difficult part of this. But just to, I forgot to mention the Korea issue, because that's the other hot topic that it's really hard for Kishida to make any action because of his fear of the backlash within the party mostly, and within from the base of the party. And that it looked like there was a picture of him and President Yoon that I saw in the paper today. And I think it's interesting that President Yoon is all smiling and Kishida is not quite. And I thought about maybe he's not smiling because if he smiles too much, he's going to get criticized by the right wing of the party of being too conciliatory. But that's a very unfortunate situation that he's so fearful of that kind of backlash. Just one word about international education policy. I'm actually a professor at the International Center, so this is what I do. And so going back to the COVID in a way, I do think that I was surprised and sadly surprised that it seems so easy to close the country so much to foreign students. And there wasn't that much of resistance to that. But 2 years was a really long time. And it really takes time to recover from being so used to the universities being closed. And same is true for students going abroad. That students, I think some students who are seniors and juniors just kind of lost the opportunity. But I think the bigger question is why it seemed to be so easy to close the country and how it seems sort of okay to the younger generation to close the country in the way it did, and how that sort of led to a legacy of maybe it's kind of okay to just remain in Japan. I'm trying to reverse that trend as part of my job. And I agree with you, the English aspect of it, but I think that's the hard thing of this past 2 years. I'm hoping that Kishida will make a difference in this regard, but I'm not that hopeful at this point, unfortunately. Thanks.
Great. I'm going to jump in now with a twin puzzle, and that would therefore target several of the speakers. But on the education, I'll just say that looking at it from the viewpoint of Canada, the trend of declining Japanese students coming to Canada is much longer. It goes back 10, 15 years. And that's more than 10 years ago that even the absolute number of Koreans have passed the number of Japanese students, more than 10 years ago. So we have lots of Koreans. We used to have lots of Chinese, not the last 2 years, and Japanese have been down for 15 years. The only other place where it's going down is Taiwan. So both Taiwanese and Japanese have been going down. Everyone else has been going up, looking at it from Canada being very, very attractive for foreign students. So it's a deeper trend. It's not just COVID. But yeah, the question remained. Now, my twin paradoxes, which were part of the motivation for this whole panel, I actually want to really play devil's advocate here about Kishida, having two huge paradoxes, but having done quite a big job. The first paradox is a domestic one. How could Kishida-san, in a way, do so well for the first year? He maintained his support rate in the 50 to 55 range all the way to the upper house election. He was decisive on COVID. I mean, much more decisive than Abe and Suga everywhere, right? I followed COVID policy in every detail, from closed border to all kind of stuff, and vaccination. Of course, vaccination started with Kono under Suga, but Kishida recruited the benefits, harvested the benefits for the vaccination. And on Ukraine, the G7, I mean, the number of things that Kishida did so decisively, historically, and then he just can't recover from the Abe assassination, the reunification church, and the funeral. It's extremely puzzling, right? How could you do so well? Everything that looked dangerous, he did well until the upper house election and the assassination. And since then, he has lost his mojo. So what's going on, right? And clearly, my own interpretation is similar to Takako-san, which is it seems to be related to the right wing of the party being so defensive or so fearful and trying to anticipate what they want and do it for them and then failing. But still, it's an interesting paradox, right? How could this happen to Kishida? And maybe he can just recover what he was doing. He had really prepared well, and he was very studious in doing all those decisions for the first year. The second paradox is the foreign policy paradox, which I think, something huge just happened. Compared the response to Ukraine now to 2014, right? No more dithering with Russia, no more cozy relation with Russia the way Abe did. Abe met 30 times with Putin. No more good relation with authoritarian, leaders the way Abe did. Kishida has gone full steam on the pro-democracy agenda, pro-G7 agenda, anti-Russia agenda, anti-China agenda, in a very decisive way and historic way. And he's the prime minister who comes from Hiroshima and who will be remembered as the one who is doubling the defense spending, right? That's a historic breakthrough in many ways. So isn't there something amazing? The piece, the dove from Hiroshima, doubles defense spending for the first time in 70 years, goes full out on a war with Ukraine, where even Abe was hesitant, right? And is much more hawkish on China than Abe ever was. Abe always had a double policy with China. He did Phillip, he did all those, strong defense and strong rule of law things, but he also engaged. At the Osaka G20, he had a long bilateral meeting with Xi, and he had a 10-point agreement, which was very far-reaching, very, very far-reaching. A lot of accommodation on the economy, a lot of work on the RCEP, all kind of stuff. And so, it's very different what Kishida has done. So isn't that something huge? How did this happen, right? How did this Kishida foreign policy paradox happen? And then that one obviously is for Takako-san. And the first one, whoever wants to take it. So anyone would like to jump in first? Yeah.
If I can pick up on your first question, I think this sagging popularity of the Kishida cabinet since this past summer. Yes, there was the funeral issue, and yes, there's the unification church issue. But I think fundamentally, the economic context really hasn't helped Kishida, and the inflation that has been hitting all of these, the industrialized countries. But and of course, Takenaka-san is more of an expert on this, but Kishida has had very little control over inflation. The BOJ hasn't been able to raise interest rates. We think that's because of their fear of the bond markets collapsing and so forth. So he's trying to fight the rising energy prices and so forth, but there's very little that he can do. I think compared to the Abe cabinet, for instance, I think a lot of people were willing to overlook a lot of things he did because the economy was good during those years, right? But I think that has really changed, especially this past summer, and that certainly hasn't helped Kishida.
Fascinating. Anyone else? Let's see.
I guess if I were to pick up on your second question,
yeah.
I guess with the Japan-China going forward, I think Japan was very fearful, or Prime Minister Abe's administration was fearful that the US is going to be too conciliatory to China, but that phase is long gone. And I think now Japan is going to have a very hawkish US, and to what extent Japan can afford to be completely on the same page with the US, I think is going to be the more difficult question. And I think we've already seen sort of developments that look like how Japan can do things slightly differently and make sure that it has a constructive relationship with China. I think that's on the way. There was a reported 7-hour meeting between the NSC chair Akiba and the equivalent, his counterpart in China in August. And so there seems to be more efforts to make sure that channels of communications are open. And that I think one of the things that we are going to see in the upcoming Kishida-Xi meeting is try to sort of find a way for Japan to not just be trying to acknowledge that it might have different interests to the US to a certain extent, but how to make that consistent with what Japan is trying to do with trying to keep the US in the region. So that I think is going to be a difficult walk that the Kishida has to do, but I think that's where we are and what we are going to see going forward, and probably a more difficult thing than what Abe did before when he was in power. I think things are a lot more difficult for Kishida.
David, do you have any thought on the first paradox?
Not particularly, actually. I think Professor Kage summarized what I would have said, which was just about the state of the economy, since that is much more certainly on people's minds here than I think we've talked about today, just because the composition of the panel, but it's a central issue that comes up every day in every single discussion. And I don't think there's any way to separate the troubles that he's had from that. Yeah, very much. But it's the way you framed the paradox was great. I'm gonna steal that without attribution for one of my next lectures. So just a warning.
Very glad. So we should now take some questions from the audience. I turn to Phillip first, and then we can stay a few more extra minutes.
Sure. So David Welsh, our good friend, asks, how does the Kishida administration compare to the Abe administration on gender progressive policy initiatives? I think this might be for Rieko.
Yes, thanks, Phillip, and thanks, David, for this great question. The women-friendly progressive policies is really not high on Kishida's policy priorities the way it was during the Abe cabinet. There is some discussion of introducing a new subsidy for families, for women who are cutting back on their working hours in order to care for children. It's not clear if this is really going to come through or not. But I guess over the short term, in terms of women-friendly policies, I would argue that having more of a forceful, not to say forceful, but more forthcoming policy towards COVID might serve to help women more than subsidies of any kind. And as Kenneth mentioned, COVID is much more of a concern for women than for men, and certainly with the Omicron, when there's been a lot more cases of COVID among young children, and that has really affected women's work. So yes, he's been going ahead with the latest round of vaccinations, but he hasn't been as forceful on that as Kono was last year with the first 2 rounds of vaccinations. And so I would say that that would really help women. And if he fails in that, and if the cases really explode this coming winter, that could really hurt Kishida. Thanks.
Great. So should I take the next one? How much, from an anonymous attendee, how much agency decision-making power do you think Kishida personally had in deciding things like the state funerals? Was he forced to acquiesce to other influential figures within the party? And I would add, in this case, do we have any inkling who is pushing Kishida to do those things?
I would defer to others on that, but since I did talk about the state funeral, let me just say that my sense is the agency is certainly his. I mean, I don't think there's any dispute about that. I think the real question is whether or not he himself felt limited in this regard. And I would go back to what Professor Hikotani, I think, correctly pointed out, which is a certain timidity on his part, which may be a character issue, but it may just be the nature of following somebody like Abe, given his stature in office and his time in office. And so I think that he may not feel that he's got all the agency, but the fact is that it would have been, again, the history of this within the party, which is well known, well documented and so forth, ought to have been enough for a prime minister with at least some backbone on this to be able to push back, even if he was getting internal pressure, to say, we've tried this in the past, it has failed. Even when somebody like Sato Eisaku tried, even when somebody like Prime Minister Miki tried to do it for Prime Minister Sato, we were not able to pull it off. It's not going to happen. There are other ways in which we can honor Prime Minister Abe without going ahead with a state funeral that's likely to cost the party more than it's likely to gain us. I mean, the evidence was there. I think it was his agency. I just think it was a fundamental miscalculation on his part about what he needed to be scared of.
I agree. And if I were to add, he seemed really general, like this is kind of a weird way to put it. He just seemed really, really shocked by Abe's passing, and because they were actually pretty close. And that
Yes.
and it seemed like he didn't really think through.
Yes. Yes.
I don't think he was forced into it. It just seemed more spontaneous, and it seemed like he didn't know what he was getting into
Right.
when he announced that. That's kind of my reading, and I might be wrong, but I wouldn't say that it was this like pressure, like midnight call from some whatever person in the LDP kind of thing. I think it was more of a miscalculation, as Dave said.
And if I could just add, I think there's a tendency sometimes to view like emotionality as being sort of like tangential to the stuff of politics. There's the real stuff, then there's the emotional stuff. And I have trouble separating those things myself. And I'm not certain that he himself can. I mean, all the evidence we have about Prime Minister Kishida is he himself is a bit of a sentimentalist. He did seem to have been shocked. I didn't know Prime Minister Abe. I was not a fan of Prime Minister Abe. I myself was shocked and deeply saddened for weeks afterwards. And I can only imagine what it would have been like for somebody like Prime Minister Kishida. So I would simply point out that I just think that he was probably overwhelmed by events in ways that led him to make, I think, a fundamental miscalculation.
Can I pipe in here as an ex-journalist? I think this is a case of Nagatacho being separated from the feelings of the population as a whole, that personal relationships between people in Nagatacho who do not necessarily agree with each other politically are very powerful, because after all, they keep getting elected and become a kind of a small coterie. But Abe was incredibly unpopular among a large swath of the Japanese public, especially journalists, of course, because he had, I mean, it's not by accident that under Abe, from 2010 to quite recently, the rating of freedom of the press rating in Japan went from the low teens to 72. And this had to do with Abe's behavior towards the press and towards freedom of expression in general. So you can imagine that a lot of thinking people were not as emotional as the Prime Minister. Sorry to interject in that negative sort of way.
We should take the next question. There is a quick question maybe for Kenneth. How accurate are opinion polls in Japan these days? And we can add, by the way, there's all those comparative polls like value surveys. Japan always stands out in weird ways, like social capital being the lowest in Asia, or social trust being the lowest in Asia. Is there also something about when you ask Japanese, they tend to respond, I don't know, and it is a down in those comparative surveys, but you would know better. Yeah.
So on the comparative dimension, you're right. In Japanese survey, respondents tend to answer don't know, or choose sort of the can't say either way middle option in surveys. And that could be something related to how they think they should answer. Like I don't want to use the word culture exactly, but people prefer the middle road. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of evidence that in the States, for example, when you ask people to rate different countries and their favorability to them, if you show them a fake country, they'll still give an answer. So not having an answer is sometimes the real attitude. Surveys in Japan in general, there are ways where surveys can be improved, but for the last 3 or 4 years, all the major survey companies are not just doing landlines, which used to be the case, but also doing cell phones to get better access to younger respondents. I think Japanese polls have much less refusal rates than American polls. So in the States, to get one person to answer a poll, you have to contact 5 to 10 people. In Japan, it's still 2 to 1. So the original sampling works. And the main thing really is that to the extent that the surveys are wrong, they might be wrong on the level, like what is the cabinet approval rating really today? But their trends over time tend to be fairly stable and are common across survey companies. So if what we're interested in is the ups and downs, then I think that is reasonably reliable.
Wonderful. Okay, I'll just bundle the last 3, and then we'll see a few answers, and we can't keep people longer. So one from Evelyn Ju. A question about the LDP politics. There have been speculations that the Abe faction was not the most satisfactory with the cabinet reshuffle. in August, primarily targeting cabinet posts to allocated members from the faction. As Justice Minister Hanashi was driven to resign a few days ago, the opposition vowed to hold Kishida responsible for political appointments. I wonder if this would generate turmoil within the LDP that may threaten Kishida's leadership. Shall we expect a minor reshuffle in the coming days? How will Kishida deal with this? A second question from Gordon Longmuir. Surely the state funeral kerfuffle will go away, the same way Andrew said, over the period leading to the next election. So who can really challenge Jiminto in any case? And then Yannick Gayama, rather than Kishida's agenda or agency, what stands out to you as the LDP's long-term agenda relative to the Japanese population concerns? So a deeper question here. So you can do a last round and for everyone, and you could pick the question that's most relevant to you. Given population, and the last one, maybe start with Rieko-san, and then.
Thanks. I think I'll pick up on the last one, and the Japanese population's concerns. I think what I might point to is its failure to really address the demographic problem, which is what Andrew alluded to earlier as well. It's in terms of long-term agenda, this really has been a long-term, long-standing issue that has really been around for at least the last 40, 50 years, and it really has consistently dropped the ball on this. It seems to not quite know how to go about doing it, and it continues to be really handcuffed / confused as to what to do. So that's really what I would point to. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe next, Kenneth, do you want to address any of those questions?
Yes, actually, let me follow up on Rieko's point. The demographic transition, one, of course, is the declining population and continuing low birth rates. But the other is what's often referred to as Tokyo Ikkyokushuchu. It's over-concentration of human and capital resources in Tokyo and in urban areas generally. The LDP is no longer as rural-oriented or dependent on rural seats as it used to be, even compared to 20 years ago. But rural politicians tend to still, or rural/suburban politicians tend to be dominant within the LDP's hierarchy towards the top. And that means that questions about how to reallocate resources, how to redevelop and re-energize rural communities remains large. And a lot of that during the Abe administration was banked on increasing tourism. And that came to a halt with COVID, as seen with the failure of the Olympics insofar as spotlighting areas of Japan outside of Tokyo. And so I think this will continue to be a big issue with the demographic issues that Rieko raised.
Great. Maybe Takako-san, would you like to pick any of those questions?
Sure. So I guess the demographic challenge, especially with the aging, it's not just the size or the number, but the composition is going to be a huge issue for Japan's defense going forward, because we can't just buy hardware. We don't have enough people, 18-year-olds. And that just is going to be very difficult. And I think Japan, fundamentally has to think about the fact that it's going to be a smaller country in terms of population, and how to keep ourselves safe is going to be really a challenge. And that's something we need to think about. But I guess the first point about who else, I wonder what other panelists think, but it's lack of a better alternative is kind of a blessing and a curse in a way, that the better alternative, both in terms of the opposition and also within the LDP. I don't think there's somebody that other LDP members can agree on to be alternative to Kishida. So we just kind of keep on muddling through with the unpopular prime minister. So I don't really see that coming in the near future. And I don't really know, well, I don't think it's a good thing for Japan as a country, but I think that's where we are with this current cabinet. So that's for me. Thanks.
Well, sobering thoughts. David, any last thoughts on any of those questions?
Yeah, so well, since my answers to this point have been uniformly terrible and unresponsive, I'll just add that the one part of my presentation that I couldn't get to because I forgot to do, like, set up the PowerPoint correctly, was that when they broadcast the Prime Minister's state funeral, Abe's state funeral, I actually caught it on Nihon Terebi, and where they were actually doing commentary and cutting to commercials of like what Ibangumi and stuff like that during it. It's a very jarring experience. But much more so would have been had I turned to Terebi Tokyo, where instead of showing the state funeral, they decided to show the 1992 film Beethoven about a large Saint Bernard who magically touches the lives of the family that adopts him. And I don't think that that's necessarily germane to the future of Japanese politics, but it's probably more relevant and useful than anything I can think of on my own. So I did want to share that.
Fascinating. Andrew, do you have any concluding thoughts or response to those questions?
I just want to comment on Kenneth's bringing up the issue of tourism. I'm frankly, the idea that inbound tourism is somehow going to save Japan is, I think, an indication of just how desperate the country is economically, because you know, it's like saying, well, you know, this will, you know, we will replace the declining number of workers and consumers by temporarily having foreigners come in and do consumption, you know, on to make up for our declining population. And also, it also points to the absence of an understanding that innovation is absolutely necessary for saving Japan's economy and for guaranteeing a future. That the investment shouldn't be in sprucing up Kyoto, but in making investments in international education and such, and basically taking a look at the future. And it is this is what seems to me to be most disturbing when looking at the Kishida administration, that Kishida is letting himself be distracted by essentially emotional issues and worrying about, I don't know whether he's personally worried about the decline in his popularity, but he certainly should be emphasizing those things that he is doing. And I'm not sure that he's doing enough of that. Sorry for this cri de coeur, but that's how I feel. Thank you so much to everybody. I'm very, very honored to be here and to have learned so much from everyone else.
Phillip, would you like to address anything?
Sure, just briefly, I think, you know, one of the open questions is Japan's role in the world. And Abe certainly had a vision about Japan's role in the world, whether you liked it and agreed with it or not. And, you know, he articulated this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and now everybody has a Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada's coming up with one, South Korea has one, of course, the United States has used very similar language to Japan. And so in some sense, Japan has this perceived leadership role in the world now, but what's not so clear is whether Japan has the national resources to put behind it, or whether the Japanese public is really interested in this kind of role, given all of the domestic issues that Japan faces. And so I think this is an interesting issue. And, you know, it's not clear to me that Kishida is providing a very decisive answer to where Japan is going to go now that Abe is off of the stage. But I think this will certainly remain an important question as we observe Japan over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Phillip. And I'll add a couple optimistic words. I'm actually quite impressed by some of the major policy changes and development during the Kishida cabinet, you know, including what he called DX and GX. You know, they built actually some of it started on the Suga, but on the green tech movement and, you know, even the digital economy, what we heard from Harukata earlier, those indicate major investments in essentially the twin industrial revolutions that are happening. And with the national economic security law here too, Japan has set some of the, you know, frontier actions. So we find a lot of action actually on some critical, you know, infrastructure of the future political economy. So there's much to watch. And in fact, Canada is looking at it thinking, oh, we're behind, because there's all this DX, GX stuff that's happening, and national economic security law. So there's a lot going on. I would bring the more optimistic view here. It's interesting also how within the Japanese bubble, there tends to be always more self-criticism. And we find the same in Korea, by the way. There's that very deep self-criticism and focus on small issues of the moment, and a lack of perspective sometimes on some major actions that are happening at the same time, or as well as the foreign policy shift that Japan is going through, right, which is sort of historic. But with those words, I will thank all the presenters here. You've done a fabulous job. All of our wonderful team, and the audience who has stayed with us for extra time, as well as you speakers. So thank you for staying longer. This has been a wonderful time altogether, and we look forward to future events with all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
It was a
Bye-bye.
great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.